Hi, if you live in or around Laguna, Niguel, and you're even thinking of selling your home, this information is for you. My name is Randy Orr. I'm a local agent here in Laguna, Niguel. Having been in the business 27 years and sold over 1,000 properties, I want to provide you as the seller weekly information. So every week I'm going to have valuable information that you're going to want to subscribe to my channel for if you're considering selling. Today I want to go over contingencies. The buyer will have a set of contingencies that of course you and your agent can counter during the negotiation, but there are certain defaults to the contract that are applicable to all 7 of the contingencies that I'm going to cover with you today. The first contingency I want to talk about is loan contingency. Now that is different and separate from an appraisal contingency. If you're financing the property, you will need a loan contingency. Being pre-qualified as the buyer gives the seller a certain amount of assurance that the loan is going to be able to be achieved for the borrower. But the buyer will have a loan contingency with a default of 17 days in the contract. Everything in the contract is negotiable, so the 17 days could float depending upon negotiation. But the default of the contract, as the seller, you need to be aware of, is that the buyer will have 17 days to get their loan approved. If the loan for some reason cannot be fulfilled, if the lender cannot commit to a loan for the borrower, then the buyer has the right to cancel based on this contingency. There are 6 other contingencies. Along with loan is appraisal. Now, not every transaction must have an appraisal contingency. It gets a little tricky as the borrower because unless the borrower can finance the entire amount of the loan, even if the property doesn't appraise, that may be problematic. But oftentimes within the contract, the borrower or the buyer will have, in addition to the loan contingency, an appraisal contingency. If the property does not appraise, typically one of 3 things happen. Either the buyer could back out, the buyer can insist on paying the lower price and the seller can accommodate and adjust the sales price down to the appraised value, or there's some negotiation where maybe you meet somewhere in the middle as long as the borrower, the buyer, can finance the loan and be approved for a property that doesn't appraise. With the market that we've been having, appraisals sometimes do and don't come in. If you're a seller and you have a loan contingency, this is very reasonable. If the buyer is a strong buyer, meaning they're possibly putting down 30%, 35, 50%, then you probably have the upper hand to negotiate and counter out the appraisal contingency, saying that whether the property does or doesn't appraise, the buyer then must go forward. They don't have that contingency. Again, the default for these 2, the loan and the appraisal, are both 17 days, but those dates can float. You can negotiate either longer periods of time or shorter periods of time. My advice for a seller is to always negotiate or try to negotiate with your agent the shortest amount of contingency periods. I don't want to get into negotiating those and strategies to negotiate, but a good agent with communication to the other agent can help shorten those time periods for you as the seller. The other contingency that the buyer will have is to review the seller's documents. We call them, the nickname being disclosures. You as the seller will have a package delivered to you, sometimes electronically, but it'll be a package of disclosures, which is your opportunity to tell the prospective buyer everything about the home. My advice is tell them everything about the home. You see, during the honeymoon period, which is the excitement of being able to buy a home and being in contract before the property closes escrow, during that honeymoon period, you can pretty much tell the buyer anything, and a lot of times, or most of the time, the deal will continue forward. If you don't disclose, and I don't want to get too much into the disclosures because I'm going to do another video on disclosures, but the disclosures that you're going to deliver as a seller to the buyer is a contingency that the buyer has to review. Don't be afraid of disclosure. Disclose everything. During the honeymoon period, they'll overlook everything. The day escrow closes, everything shifts, everything changes. They find out that you didn't disclose that there's a crack in the sink, lawsuit time. So disclose, over disclose everything. But again, a 70-day contingency for the buyer. If they get the disclosure package back, if there is anything in the disclosures that they are not happy with, they do have the right to cancel the contract. The other disclosure, number is this 4, is preliminary title report. They, the borrower, the buyer of your home, will have an opportunity to look at the preliminary title report showing things about the property. Boundary lines, for example, will typically be within the title report. So all of that gets delivered. Your listing agent should take care of acquiring all those documents for you. You won't be responsible for doing that, providing you have a good agent, a good escrow company, and a good title company working with you as the seller. Common interest is another contingency that the buyer has. The buyer will have an opportunity to review all the common interest. Typically, we refer to this as the homeowners association documents, the HOA documents. Now, you, the seller, also have a period of time negotiated in the contract to provide to the buyer the homeowners association documents. There's typically a fee that you, the seller, will have to pay to get a copy of those. My advice for you, if you're a seller, is never use, our legal team instructs us heavily, to never advise the seller to use the disclosures that they received, repackage them, or just provide them and hand them down the line to the new buyer. If there is a single page missing, it's a legal hornet's nest. So the best thing would be to invest in a brand new set of homeowners association documents. The minutes will have to be current. You'll always have to pay for those, but a lot of sellers try to save a couple $100 by repackaging or using the homeowners association documents, the HOA documents that they got, passing them along to the new buyer. Discouraged, very much discouraged. Don't do it. It's not worth it. Even if there's no page missing when you pass it along, the story of a page missing could pop its head up in a future time. So make sure that it's a brand new set from the homeowners association. All of this facilitated through escrow. Again, a default of 17 days where you have to provide the disclosures as a contingency for the buyer. They have 17 days to review this. So property condition is another very important contingency that the buyer has the right to do all of their inspections, again, within a 17-day period. Not only complete the inspections, but if requests for repairs come up as a result of the investigation of property by the buyer, then the negotiation of those requests for repairs again have to be all done within the 17 days, which is typically why the buyer wants to get on the inspections very, very soon. Now, all inspections are done at the cost. The buyer pays the cost, so all at the expense of the buyer. And all of the inspections done by the buyer, and there are many, many, must be done in a non-invasive way. In other words, they can't cut holes in the walls, can't dig a hole in the foundation or in landscape. Anything non-invasive, the buyer has the right to hire an inspector and perform non-invasive inspections at the property during the due diligence time, with the seller allowing access to the property during that negotiated period of time. It's very important for the seller, for you, the seller, to allow the buyer at their requested time to do their inspections so that they stay within the timeline of the contract. That's very important as well. The types of things that could come up during the investigation of the property could result in a list of requests for repairs. This is very, very common. I will do a separate video on the process of requests for repairs. It would be a shame to let a deal fall apart over a $20 washer, and I've seen it happen. So I'll get back to that with another video, but property condition is a contingency of the buyer, again, to be removed within the 17 days or negotiated in the contract, everything done in writing. All these contingencies have to be removed in writing, and I'm going to get to that. But let's finish up with the last contingency, was review of all lease items associated with the property. For example, water softeners typically are oftentimes leased. The big one today is solar. As the seller, you will either need to transfer the remaining balance of the solar lease. If it's a purchase, of course, there's nothing to worry about. But if the solar system is leased, there is oftentimes a significant financial pass along that is negotiated in the contract. Either the buyer has to assume it or the seller has to pay it off, again, negotiable. But these disclosures that you're going to be making to the buyer all have to be done with a default of 17 days. So we've got loan, we've got appraisal, we've got investigation of the property. Your chance to review the condition of the property is probably the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones in my mind, for the buyer and for the seller to make sure that the disclosures are done properly. But the buyer has the right to do all investigations as long as they're willing to pay for them and be non-invasive. If they are in any way invasive, you must have, as the buyer, written permission from the seller to cut a hole in the wall, to dig a hole in the landscape, to look at a sewer system. Anything that's invasive must be granted permission in writing from the seller. Other than that, you as the buyer have the right to do any investigation you want. But getting back to couching this in disclosures and contingencies, the buyer has a contingency to investigate everything about the property, non-invasive, all done within 17 days. If any of these contingencies seem like they're running long, then the buyer has the right to try to renegotiate the timeline, but you as the seller are not obligated to extend any timeline. Depending upon whether you have a backup offer or the market conditions, whether you have a good or a bad offer, will reflect on the seller their desire to extend the timeline. If the buyer is a really good buyer for you, you want to close, you have future plans where you're going to go, then you're going to want to comply and try to adjust timelines, typically a day or two or three. But all of these contingencies that the buyer has and all of the disclosures that you are obligated to make in a timely fashion have to be all wrapped up in 17 days. So use 17 days from the day of acceptance. The day of acceptance is day 0. It is not day 1. So if you accept an offer on Friday, Friday is day 0, Saturday is day 1. Certain holidays are not included, weekends, they count as a day. So work closely with your listing agent. Your listing agent should be extremely familiar with the timeline for these, but the disclosures that you make as the seller and the contingencies that the buyer have, if you're a seller, you want to make sure with communication through your agent to their agent that all of these things are being worked on in the process of the escrow expeditiously. Very early on, the inspection should be scheduled from the buyer, not your responsibility as a seller, but you as a seller want to make sure that the buyer is on it. The inspections for the condition of the property should be scheduled within the first 4, 5, 6 days, very quickly, because you want to have all of these contingencies removed within 17 days, knowing from 17 days forward till the close of escrow, you're going to close without any other problems. This is very important. When the contingencies are removed, they are removed in writing. It is called an active removal of contingency. Now, in the olden days, our contracts used to be passive, which means when day 18 rolled around and the buyer didn't say anything or deliver anything in writing, remember, everything in real estate is in writing. If day 18 rolled around, silence was deemed acceptance. That is not how our current contract works today. We have an active removal of contingencies. All the contingencies that I walked you through that have a 17-day deadline, they have to be removed in writing. There is a form that the selling agent, the agent for the buyer, will deliver to the agent for the seller, the listing agent, naming all of the contingencies that are going to be removed at that time. Now, the buyer can remove some of them as they go along, and some of these timelines can be negotiated to have different or staggered timelines. For example, you may want to tighten up the property condition. You may want to shorten it from 17 days to 12 days. At 12 days, the buyer must remove in writing that contingency with all the subsequent contingencies to be removed when their date falls due. So, sounds a little complicated. It may be for you if you don't do this all the time. I do it all the time, day in, day out. So I'm very familiar with the contingencies. I'm very familiar with the timeline. I'm very familiar with how to tactfully negotiate these. If I can help you, if you need to reach out and ask a question, my phone number is here on the screen. I look forward to helping you. If you're looking for a listing agent, I'd be honored to help you. I've been doing this a long time, enjoy helping sellers. And again, Randy Orr with Berkshire Hathaway, changing lives one home at a time.